16 Army bombers took off from one carrier deck and headed straight for Japan. They were North American B-25 Mitscher medium bombers, not naval aircraft, and USS Hornet had never launched them in combat before. On the 18th of April 1942, in the Western Pacific, that contradiction became a military problem with no safe answer. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle stood at the center of it for the United States. Beyond the horizon was the audience that did not expect him. Japanese commanders and civilians who did not believe American twin-engine bombers could appear over the home islands from the Pacific. The raid force was still hundreds of miles from Japan. The sea was rough. Hornet's flight deck was short for a land-based bomber, and once a B-25 went off that deck, it could not return to the carrier. After a Japanese picket vessel sighted the force, Doolittle and Captain Mark A. Mitscher had only hours to decide. The operation joined Army bombers to a Navy carrier force under wartime pressure. The date was the 18th of April 1942. The place was the Western Pacific, east of Japan. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle commanded 16 B-25B Mitscher bombers and 80 airmen. Captain Mark A. Mitscher commanded USS Hornet, hull number CB-8, the carrier that carried them. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. commanded Task Force 16, which included USS Hornet and USS Enterprise, hull number CB-6, with Enterprise providing the main fighter cover for the approach. The plan depended on distance, fuel, and surprise. The B-25B was a twin-engine medium bomber with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches and a normal crew of 5. It was designed for land bases, not carrier decks. Hornet's flight deck gave the raiders only a short deck run, and there was no system for recovering them aboard ship. After striking Japan, the crews were supposed to continue west to airfields in China. Japanese defenses expected attack from more conventional directions. They did not expect Army medium bombers launched by carriers in the Pacific. If the force was detected too early, range and fuel would decide the mission. The approach had begun days earlier under strict limits. Hornet carried the 16 bombers on her flight deck, which meant her own air group was below and could not operate normally. The carrier's deck load itself showed how unusual the mission was. To make the distance possible, the B-25Bs had been modified before embarkation. Extra fuel capacity was added. Unneeded weight was removed. Crews practiced short takeoffs at Eglin Field in Florida, because a medium bomber had to leave a carrier deck in a run far shorter than any normal Army runway. Those preparations solved only part of the problem. The mission still depended on launching at the planned point, bombing quickly, and then flying on to China. The bombers were not meant to come back to Hornet. Every mile added before launch reduced the margin left after the strike. That put Doolittle's air group and Halsey's naval force on the same clock. On the 18th of April 1942, the Japanese outer screen did what it was designed to do. A picket vessel made contact with the American force well before the intended launch point. The ship identified in the record as Nito Maru. Once that contact existed, the risk changed at once. Surprise at sea was in danger. A force built around 2 fleet carriers could still defend itself, but the mission on Hornet was not a normal carrier airstrike. 16 Army bombers were exposed on the flight deck, tied to a one-way launch. For the Japanese side, the unseen assumption still held. Carriers might send carrier planes, but not North American B-25Bs. For the Americans, that assumption no longer mattered as much as distance. The planned launch point was lost. The new question was mathematical. Could Mitscher bombers loaded for a raid still reach Japan from much farther out and then continue toward China with fuel left? Doolittle was ready in the lead aircraft. Mitscher had Hornet turned into the wind. The decision on whether to launch from roughly 650 nautical miles from Japan now had to be made. Halsey chose to launch. Mitscher brought Hornet into the wind, and Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle took the first B-25B forward on the rain-swept deck soon after 8 o'clock on the 18th of April 1942. The planned launch point had been much closer to Japan. Now the force was roughly 650 nautical miles out. That meant every bomber would have to fly farther to the target and still try to reach China. Doolittle's aircraft began its takeoff run first. The lead bomber lifted clear, proving the basic calculation could hold. One by one, the other 15 Mitchels followed. Hornet launched all 16. That solved the immediate naval problem. It also fixed the aviators' next problem. None could turn back. The raiders then separated toward their assigned objectives on Honshu. Their target list was spread across Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The strike force reached Japan in daylight. Air raid alarms sounded over the home islands, and Japanese observers saw what their planning had not expected from the Pacific approach: twin-engine Army bombers, not carrier attack aircraft. The bombers attacked industrial and military-related targets with a limited bomb load made necessary by fuel. Anti-aircraft fire met them over several cities, and some Japanese fighters rose to intercept, but the defense was reacting to an attack that had already arrived. The attackers were moving fast, at low and medium altitude, and they were spread across several urban and military areas rather than concentrated on one point. That reduced the effectiveness of the immediate response. For the Japanese side, the first clear fact was that the home islands had been bombed. For the American side, the second half of the mission now became the harder one. The extra launch distance had consumed fuel margins that were already narrow. After releasing their bombs, the crews turned southwest toward China. They flew into worsening weather, darkness, and fuel exhaustion. One aircraft under Captain Edward J. York diverted north and landed near Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. The other 15 continued toward the Chinese coast. By the end of the raid phase, the tactical reality was fixed. Japan had been struck, and almost every crew now faced a forced landing or bailout beyond friendly lines. The launch worked because the B-25B had just enough performance margin when stripped for range and flown with exact technique. A standard B-25B was not a carrier aircraft. It was about 53 feet long, with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by two Wright R2600 engines. For this mission, additional fuel tanks were installed, raising fuel capacity far beyond normal internal load. Weight was cut wherever possible. Lower gun turrets were removed. Some defensive equipment was reduced, and crews carried a bomb load suited to the longer flight. Training mattered as much as hardware. At Eglin Field, Doolittle's crews practiced short takeoffs marked to approximate carrier deck distance. The method was simple and exact. Engines had to be fully developed before brake release. Elevator input had to hold the aircraft on the edge of stall without sinking into the sea. On Hornet, the headwind created by the carrier's speed was essential. Without it, deck run and lift margin would have been even tighter. The decision at sea followed clear operational logic. Halsey could not risk allowing the picket contact to report long enough for Japanese forces to respond, and Mitscher could not protect the bombers indefinitely on a loaded flight deck. Doolittle understood that launching early endangered the recovery leg to China, but not launching risked losing the mission altogether. Japanese planners had prepared for carrier raids and for attacks from more conventional directions, not for Army medium bombers launched from a carrier and sent one way. That mismatch shaped the response over Japan. Defenders did react with anti-aircraft fire and fighters, but they were responding to an unexpected delivery method. The real American advantage was not bombing weight. It was operational surprise at the point of attack, even after strategic surprise at sea had been lost. The physical results in Japan were limited. The raid caused comparatively light material damage, and Japanese anti-aircraft fire was generally inaccurate against the fast, scattered attackers. No B-25 was shot down over the target area. The direct American combat loss over Japan was therefore not in the strike itself but in what followed after the longer-than-planned withdrawal. 15 aircraft headed for China. None reached its intended Chinese airfield. In darkness and poor weather, crews either bailed out or crash-landed along the Chinese coast and interior. Of the 80 raiders, 69 eventually reached safety with Chinese help. Captain Edward J. York and his 4-man crew landed in the Soviet Union and were interned. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces in China. 3 of those captured men were executed by the Japanese in October 1942, and 1 died in captivity in December 1943. The other 4 survived the war. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle himself bailed out in China after his aircraft ran out of fuel. He initially believed the loss of all 16 aircraft might mean the mission would be judged a failure. The United States command reached a different conclusion. The raid had hit the Japanese capital region and several major cities only 4 months after Pearl Harbor. Japanese authorities now had to account for a successful air attack on Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka by aircraft that had approached from the Pacific in a form they had not expected. American commanders had proved that a carrier could deliver Army medium bombers to striking distance of the home islands, but they had also seen the narrow margin that made every later detail of the launch and its aftermath matter. The choice of the B-25 had been settled before the force ever reached Hornet. Other Army aircraft were considered, including the Martin B-26 Marauder and the Douglas B-23 Dragon, but the Mitchell offered the needed balance of range, bomb load, and takeoff performance. Doolittle also wanted an aircraft with good low-altitude handling and enough wing area to leave a carrier deck without catapult assistance. In practice, that made the B-25 the workable compromise, not an ideal machine for the job. The fuel changes were more improvised than elegant. Additional tanks were installed in places the bomber had not been designed to use that way, including the crawlway above the bomb bay and parts of the lower turret area after the turret was removed. Crews carried roughly 1,100 gallons of fuel. To save weight, the radio liaison set was removed, de-icers were taken out, and even the Norden bomb sight was not used. Doolittle had a simpler aiming device built from about 20 cents worth of materials, later nicknamed the Mark Twain. The defensive armament was also adjusted to the mission's reality. The lower turret disappeared entirely, and in the tail some crews carried black painted broom handles to suggest extra machine guns. That detail was not expected to defeat fighters. It was meant to add uncertainty during a fast pass over the target and then save weight for fuel. Every pound cut from the airplane was part of the launch calculation as much as the bombing plan. On Hornet, the visual arrangement mattered. All 16 bombers were secured nose to tail along the flight deck, leaving the carrier committed to one purpose until the last Army aircraft was gone. Hornet's own air group could not operate from a deck packed with Mitchells. That is one reason Enterprise's aircraft covered the force. A single crash on takeoff could have blocked the deck and left the rest of the bombers trapped, while the task force faced possible air or surface attack. Doolittle's own departure showed how narrow the margin was. Hornet was driving into a strong wind and pitching in heavy seas. As the bow rose and fell, the lead B-25 used almost every foot available before lifting away. Each successful takeoff did more than save one crew. It kept the deck clear for the next aircraft, and with every launch the mission became harder for Japan to stop and easier for historians to treat as inevitable when it was anything but. Japanese leaders quickly understood that the immediate bomb damage was not the central issue. The home islands had been reached by American aircraft launched from the Pacific, and that fact exposed a gap between Japan's defensive assumptions and American practice. Contemporary Japanese accounts and post-war studies both point to the same result. The raid sharpened concern about the outer perimeter and about the need to destroy the American carrier force before it could support another surprise attack. In the Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had already argued for a decisive operation against American carriers. The raid strengthened that case. The move toward the Midway operation cannot be reduced to one cause, but the April attack reinforced the urgency. It supported the argument that Japan had to extend and secure its eastern defensive line and force the United States Navy into battle. In that sense, a small raid had strategic weight out of proportion to its physical destruction. It also exposed limits in homeland air defense. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries fired heavily in several places, but the raiders were dispersed and arrived in a form the defenders had not prepared for. Civil defense warnings had little time to work. The issue was not that Japan lacked aircraft or guns. It was that planning had not expected Army medium bombers to appear this way. After the raid, concern about early warning, interception, and the vulnerability of major cities became harder to dismiss. American official histories make the same contrast from the other side. The raid was not important because it burned large sections of Japanese industry. It was important because it demonstrated reach, improvisation, and cooperation between services under wartime pressure. Samuel Eliot Morison treated it as a psychological and strategic success despite the loss of all 16 aircraft. Gordon W. Prange, writing on the opening phase of the Pacific War, likewise placed weight on the shock to Japanese confidence. That is why the raid sits in military history as more than a daring stunt. It forced Japanese planners to react to a capability the Americans had created for one use and then proved in combat, and the cost of that proof fell on specific men, on the captives, and on the Chinese civilians who tried to help them. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle led from the first aircraft off the deck and then shared the same ending as most of his crews. After bombing Tokyo, he flew on toward China, ran out of fuel in bad weather, and bailed out. He later said he expected severe criticism because every airplane had been lost. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and promotion to Brigadier General. The mission that he thought might end his career became the action most closely tied to his name. Captain Edward J. York followed the one route that did not end in China. After attacking his assigned target area, he judged that his fuel state would not carry him to the Chinese coast. He turned north and landed in the Soviet Union near Vladivostok. The Soviet authorities interned York and his four-man crew because the USSR was not at war with Japan. They remained in Soviet custody for more than a year before making their way out through a managed escape route into British-controlled territory. Among the captured raiders, the best documented names belong to Lieutenant Dean E. Hallmark, Lieutenant William G. Farrow, and Staff Sergeant Harold A. Spatz. They were among the 8 Americans taken by Japanese forces in China. After a Japanese trial, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were executed in October 1942. Another captured raider, Corporal Jacob Deschizer, survived imprisonment and was liberated at the end of the war. One of the 8, Lieutenant Robert J. Mader, died in captivity in December 1943. The Chinese side carried a much larger burden than the raid's short American bombing phase suggests. Chinese soldiers, officials, and civilians helped many of the airmen escape Japanese patrols after the crash landings and bailouts. Japanese reprisals followed in Zhejiang and Jiangxi. The documented record shows mass killing, destruction of towns and villages, and the use of biological warfare during the campaign that followed. Estimates of the Chinese dead vary widely in the literature, but the scale was immense. The raid ended over Japan in minutes, but for the men who flew it and the people who sheltered them, its consequences extended deep into the war that followed. Within days, the raid had effects far beyond the bomb damage. In the United States, newspapers and radio carried the news as proof that Japan could be reached. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used the success publicly, joking that the bombers had come from Shangri-La, while the military protected the real method. Doolittle, who had expected disgrace, was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted 2 grades to Brigadier General. In Japan, the military and political effect moved in the opposite direction. The Army and Navy now had to explain how enemy bombers had crossed the outer screen and struck the capital region. The raid accelerated measures to tighten home defense and added urgency to plans already under discussion for expanding the defensive perimeter eastward. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been pressing for an operation to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers. After the 18th of April, that argument gained force. The most immediate consequence fell not in Tokyo but in China. Japanese forces began the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign in May 1942, partly to punish Chinese areas that had aided the raiders and to destroy airfields that might support further attacks. The campaign lasted into the summer. Chinese civilians and soldiers bore the main cost. Towns and villages were destroyed, and Japanese forces carried out mass killings. The region also saw the use of biological warfare by Japanese units. At sea, the same American carriers were still needed for the next crisis. Hornet and Enterprise turned south after the launch. They were not present at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, but the carrier war moved on quickly. At Midway in June 1942, Hornet was part of the American force under Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance after Halsey was hospitalized. The raid had not won a campaign by itself, but it had added pressure inside Japanese planning at the exact moment Yamamoto was seeking approval for Midway. By October 1942, Hornet was again in action, this time at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. She was heavily damaged by Japanese aircraft and torpedoes, abandoned, and later sunk. The ship that had launched the B-25s was gone less than 7 months after the raid. The question left behind is not whether the bombs did major damage. It is how much strategic weight one short strike could carry. This episode is treated as a turning point because the contrast before and after the 18th of April 1942 is clear in the record. Before the raid, Japan had opened the Pacific War with an image of reach and American weakness. After the raid, Japanese leaders had proved that the home islands were not beyond immediate retaliation. The material damage remained limited. The strategic meaning did not. American official history and standard accounts make that distinction directly. Samuel Eliot Morison described the operation as a brilliant morale weapon and a blow to Japanese prestige. Gordon W. Prange placed it in the chain of events that sharpened Japan's decision to force a decisive carrier battle. Neither argument depends on exaggerated bombing results. Both rest on the same documented fact. The raid exposed a defensive assumption that had failed. For the Japanese side, the effect was practical. The raid strengthened support for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to seize Midway and bring the United States carriers into battle. Midway had already been under consideration. The April attack did not create the operation from nothing. What it did was reinforce the sense that delay carried risk. The American carriers had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor. One of them had now delivered a strike on Tokyo itself. That is why the raid stands apart from operations measured only by tonnage dropped or ships sunk. It proved that reach, surprise, and joint planning could produce strategic effect even when tactical destruction was modest. It also proved something about the American command climate in 1942. Halsey, Mitscher, and Doolittle accepted severe risk for a result that could not be measured in the usual way on the day it happened. The same raid also marked a boundary in Japanese confidence. From that point forward, homeland defense and carrier security could not be treated as separate problems. Strategy had changed. What remained was the fate of the men who carried that change, and the way the mission was kept in public memory after the war. James H. Doolittle did not fade after April 1942. He later commanded the 12th Air Force, the 15th Air Force, and then the 8th Air Force in Europe. In 1944 he was promoted to Major General. He retired as a Lieutenant General in 1946 and was advanced to full general on the retired list in 1985. He died in 1993 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Mark A. Mitscher went on to command Fast Carrier Task Force operations in the Pacific, reached the rank of Admiral, and died in 1947. Captain Edward J. York remained in the Army Air Forces during the war and died in 1971. Corporal Jacob Deschizer returned to Japan after the war as a missionary and died in 2008. The raiders themselves created one of the best-known commemorative traditions of the war. Beginning in 1945, surviving Doolittle raiders held reunions and used a set of engraved silver goblets, one for each raider, turning over the cups of those who had died. The final public reunion was held in 2013 at Fort Walton Beach, Florida. The mission is preserved in several places. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio interprets the raid and displays a B-25B restored to represent a Doolittle aircraft. The USS Hornet Museum at Alameda, California preserves the story of the carrier that launched the bombers, even though the ship there is the later Hornet, CV-12, not Mitscher's CV-8. At Arlington National Cemetery, Doolittle's grave remains a focal point for remembrance. Preserved B-25s in museums and at flying events keep the aircraft itself in public view, but the raid's place in memory rests on a specific fact, not on nostalgia. 16 Army bombers really did take off from one carrier deck and head straight for Japan. That looked impossible because B-25s were not carrier aircraft. Hornet had never launched them in combat before, and the task force had been spotted too soon. Yet once those aircraft were airborne and Japan saw American bombers over its own cities, the contradiction ended. It became a fact of the war. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.